All right. So what is your main focus of research?
Well, I'm actually an 18th and 19th century British historian, but I also work on the histories of disease and fashion. So I'm mostly connected to tuberculosis in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and how it was basically sexy to look like you were dying of tuberculosis. How physicians participated in creating a beauty rhetoric that surrounded the illness, how women actually dressed to make themselves look like they had the disease, and how fashions actually were believed to be a causative agent of the illness.
Oh, okay.
So that's my first sort of project, but generally speaking, I work on the experience of illness in that period. So the next project is very much on illness experience. What does it mean to be sick, and what are the ways in which we participate in expectations for invalids? So even today, if somebody's suffering from cancer, people have difficulty sort of dealing with that in an honest way, and we expect people to sort of behave in a certain way, right? So keep your spirits up, or, I'm sorry, no, you can't be angry and depressed and sad because it makes me feel uncomfortable, right? So there is that dichotomy is still at work today.
All right. What is your favorite topic of research? And this could be something you actually do, something you've done in the past.
I mean, I've been really fortunate. I love working on sort of the experience of illness. I've thoroughly enjoyed working on tuberculosis in fashion. It's really something that, I started researching as part of my doctoral dissertation, and now I'm finishing up as a book manuscript. And it's something that every time I dive back into it, I never have a moment of going, oh, I'm so sick of this. Yeah. I love it. Even when I was writing my dissertation, I was like, well, I really wish the dissertation was written, but I love the topic. I never get bored of the topic because there's something new every time.
Have you had anything published before?
I've had things published. I actually just had my first history article accepted to the Journal of 18th Century Studies. Thank you. But I've also published in science, so I started life as a microbiologist before I became a historian. So I published quite early as a scientist, and now I've done some smaller things, book reviews, that kind of thing, but my first kind of major scholarly article is coming out. It's forthcoming at the moment, and I'm writing a second one as we speak, so.
Okay. And you're also writing a book, right?
I am.
That's the tuberculosis.
Yeah, so I finished up the book manuscript. I've just got to send it out, and I'm getting ready to start my second book project, which
Is that also about tuberculosis?
It's actually about the illness experience. So I'm taking a 360-degree look at one person's illness experience. So it's very hard to kind of assess what is the historic experience of illness, or even today, it's hard to sort of say, how do you do a comprehensive look at one person's illness experience? So because of the person I've chosen, there is a wealth of manuscript evidence, and so I'm hopeful there'll be enough to really do that. So I'm working actually on the illness and death of the youngest daughter of King George III, Princess Amelia, who was an invalid most of her life, and then actually dies of tuberculosis in 1810. And so I'm looking at things that she wrote about her illness, that her family members wrote, the physician's perspective, and because she is a public figure, sort of how is disease dealt with and the experience of being sick dealt with in the public eye.
And what year was that around? Just out of curiosity.
Amelia lives between 1783 and 1810. But she gets sick in the 1790s, so it'll really begin in the 1790s through 1810. And then her death is actually the tipping point. It is accorded, even George III said this is why his madness came back. It's basically accorded socially as well as by the king himself as the reason for his sort of descent fully into madness, which leads to the Regency in 1811.
So would you say you look into the social repercussions of disease?
Absolutely. I'm very interested in sort of the socio-cultural strategies for experiencing disease. How is a disease managed both by physicians but also socially, particularly in a period where there are very little effective therapeutic measures.
When you do your research, where is the first place you look for sources? I know that's kind of vague, like the internet, the library.
Well, the first thing I do, I actually don't usually start with the library specifically, because I'm a British historian, I'm well aware of where the sources would be housed. So the first stop I always have is the National Archives in the UK. They have a website that also links to all of the at least cataloged holdings, not everything's cataloged, but at least give you a general idea, cataloged holdings of manuscript evidence throughout the archives in the UK. Okay. So I go to Access to Archives first, and through the National Archives, the Discovery Catalog for National Archives. And so that's my first stop.
And do you usually use primary sources and secondary sources?
Absolutely. You can't write history without. And you should write it from the primary sources. So my so the Princess Amelia project, so you can see I have all of this right here. These are primary source letters that have been transcribed. So these are all things that I collected in archives and photographed and then have now transcribed. They were handwritten letters. Oh, wow. Okay. And so there's about 600 of them that have already been transcribed. I've got another probably 250 that I got this summer that I'm working through right now. And so for me to write about Amelia, I'm not so concerned with what other people have written about her. One, because nobody's really looked at her illness in this way. She's been dealt with sort of in passing by some other people, but nobody's done a critical analysis. Okay. So the start point for me is her primary sources. You should write from the primary sources out rather than the secondary sources and then find something that's cut and paste to back up,
That makes sense, because you're speaking like you want to analyze the primary sources first.
Absolutely.
And since you're kind of, it's like you said, a subject that hasn't been very critically analyzed yet, so you're working, okay, that makes sense.
Well, the other thing too, right, is that are you going to have your own interpretation, or are you just going to regurgitate somebody else's interpretation? Yeah. So you must engage with the secondary literature, absolutely. The good thing is that because my first work was on tuberculosis in this period, I have a very good command already of the literature of tuberculosis. So for this project, I'm not starting from the secondary sources. I'm starting from the primary sources out. And I can do that because I already have sort of mastered that knowledge. But, I mean, if you're starting a brand new topic that you don't know anything about, first stop is a secondary literature. And then, you really want to be able to contextualize what you're finding.
Can I ask how you got into specifically tuberculosis and fashion?
Sure. I actually can show you. I'll pull a book off the shelf. I'll show you the exact moment. So when I was doing my master's degree in Cambridge in the history and philosophy of science and medicine, I hadn't had a lot of training in it. And so I actually, I went and I bought the Cambridge History of Medicine, the Cambridge Illustrated History of Medicine. And I was reading through, let me see, I think I've got it bookmarked in here. I was reading through, and I had been a microbiologist first, and I came across this page in which the author was basically claiming that, in the 19th century, that tuberculosis was considered an attractive and beautiful way to die. And I just thought, that's insane. That's just weird. That doesn't make any sense to me. I don't understand this at all. And that was that moment where I just went, this is not in keeping with what I already understand as a modern person, an individual, about tuberculosis. See if I can find it. Of course, it's not like, I don't have it marked, of course. And so for me, that was that moment where I went, I need to look at this. And then I thought, because I've always been really interested in fashion history as well, I thought, okay, if this is a marker of beauty, how is this really playing out? Like, what happens? Like, how do people really buy into this? Is this something, because he basically puts it out there with respect to opera and ideas about women in the latter part of the 19th century. And I thought, if it's considered a hallmark of beauty, it has to have some sort of connection to like wider sociocultural ideas about beauty. And so that really kind of got me down the path into thinking about what is happening really with respect to the way in which people interact with the disease. Not just like, hi, it's an easy way to die, which is not, but also, how do you get to that point where you think a disease is something that's beautiful or easy or should be emulated. And so I really sort of took it down that road. But that was the moment. And I came out of my master's knowing exactly what I wanted to write my PhD on, which is not usual. I actually sort of, that's not the way most people do it. So I was lucky in that moment. I can't find it, of course.
That's fine. It's a big book.
It is. It's all good, though. So,
yeah. Please describe your research process. I mean, we've kind of already discussed that, I guess.
There it is.
You said with a brand new topic.
That moment.
The transience of consumptive beauty. All right.
And people had had made that connection to beauty, but nobody had actually intersected or thought about what does that mean in terms of the way people engage with it. And nobody had ever taken beauty into actually like makeup practices and fashion. So I'm the first person doing this. So
okay.
Yeah.
Very cool. So your research process, I know you already said when it's a brand new topic, you like to start with the secondary sources and see other people's analysis of the work. And then when it's on a topic like the tuberculosis in fashion, you like to see the primary sources and work outward. That makes sense. Is there anything we're kind of missing there?
Well, okay, so when you think about, so the work I do is really interdisciplinary. So I have to master the historiography of not only like British history in the 18th and 19th centuries, the historiography of medicine, the historiography of tuberculosis, as well as the historiography of women, beauty, and fashion. So there's a lot of things going on all at the same time. So this particular period in British history is one that is incredibly contentious. There's a lot going on. So things are really changing. It's also the period where we get the rise of clinical medicine. So I basically kind of started with, and I actually have, my process is, here, I'll show you. So for me, I put a lot of my research materials into Microsoft OneNote. And it's a really useful, even just for a research topic, you can just do a tab. So this basically is the entire like OneNote notebook for my doctoral dissertation and now book. And so basically every tab is like, so these are notes on secondary literature on tuberculosis, secondary literature on fashion, on disease, on beauty, on women. And then I have tabs for primary literature. So these are all like, for instance, here's the primary literature on tuberculosis. So every single one of these tabs is a book on tuberculosis I read and then took notes on. So the cool thing about OneNote is that all of these are open simultaneously. So when I go to write, I can find them.
Oh, great.
I don't have to open up a file, and you can also search everything simultaneously. Now for the Princess Amelia project, my focus has been primary sources out. Okay, so when I began this project, the very first place I went is like, well, she's a princess. Who's got her records? Well, her records are mostly housed in the Royal Archives. And the Royal Archives are in the Round Tower at Windsor Castle. But they're heavily regulated. You actually have to apply for permission. You have to get letters of recommendation. They only allow you to come in 3 days out of the week. It's a very, very sort of structured thing. You are like monitored the whole time you're there. Like if you go to the bathroom, they go with you. Like it's very crazy. But the thing that's really interesting about it is they also control, not only once you get access, they will control like what records you can see. So for instance, Princess Amelia was involved in a scandalous relationship with a man 20 years her elder.
Oh, all right.
I know. I was not permitted to see the records between her and Charles Fitzroy. Now, at the time, I was fresh out of my PhD. I was on my way to like a research conference in England, and I made double duty on it. So I was able to get into the Royal Archives and transcribe a lot of those letters. Now, you can't take photographs in the Royal Archives. You literally just have to sit there with the letters and try and figure out what they say. So I did that, but then after that, I went to various archives all over England, and I did on a research trip, in one research trip, I did 21 archives in 15 days, all over the country. So I was stationed in London, and some days I would travel 10 hours a day on the train to get up to the archives and back. But in doing that, I was able to photograph these things, and now I will put them in, so I can then put these letters in and then transcribe them. So I now have, this is where those transcriptions came from. I've also gone through the published primary literature. So there are manuscript collections or collections of like the correspondence of King George III. So I've gone through all of that. Behind you on that shelf, I've got the correspondence of George IV, of the Prince of Wales, who was Amelia's brother and also her godfather and her favorite brother. And so that's on my list of things to do right now. So I really, you know, for me, it's been collect everything related that I can find related to Amelia's illness. I am negotiating right now with the Royal Archives to get in to see the Amelia Fitzroy papers, because I found a cache of papers this summer that had previously been in private hands, that nobody has seen in more than 100 years, that the premier scholar on Princess Amelia, which is a woman, this woman right here, Flora Fraser, she had unprecedented access. She was given access to everything in the Royal Archives, including the Fitzroy papers.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Now, she is basically an incredibly wealthy, independent scholar whose mother is a very famous biographer and whose husband is George Soros. So she has money and connections that us mere mortals do not.
Yeah.
And so she was given access, and I was told that she was given unprecedented access and nobody will ever be given this access again. Now, this is a problem for me because she is not a medical historian, and she made a claim based off of very scanty evidence that runs counter to everything else I have seen and found about Amelia's illness.
So you want to prove that that is false?
She basically makes a claim that Amelia has syphilis. Off of one small piece of information in the Fitzroy Amelia papers, which suggest that Amelia is concerned she can't carry Fitzroy's baby. Now, that could be anything. She's been an invalid her whole life. That could be anything. But she claims it is syphilis. So I'm trying to make a case with the Royal Archives, and I think I will get some access to it. But I tracked down these papers that were not cataloged, that were in private hands until 1949. They haven't been seen since a gentleman by the name of William Shakespeare Child Pemberton, the ponziest British name of all time, actually wrote a book called The Romance of Princess Amelia, published in 1910. So the last scholars to look at these letters was him. And yeah, so Flora Fraser didn't know about them or didn't find them. And so I located them. I had to do genealogy through the peerage. I contacted the Viscount Ullswater, who happens to be the Conservative Party whip in the House of Lords. And so I had to contact him because it was his family. And I'm like, "Dear Lord Ullswater, hello, my name is..." And I basically went through and contacted him, told him exactly what I was looking for, where they had been, that they had been in his family's hands in like 1908 at the time. And then did he have any ideas of like where they might be? Were they still in his family's hands? And would he be willing to allow me to have access to them? And he was really kind. He wrote me back and he told me where they were. He said that they're all housed in the Ipswich Record Office, which is fantastic. They're not listed in the catalog at all. So without doing that, I never would have found them. Because they're not, even when you go to the record office and you search for these records, they are not listed on the online catalog. So I actually had to call and talk to them and say, "This is what I'm looking for," and they had to find them for me. And then I called and I said, "I want to take photographs. This is what I want to see. I'm coming on this day." They're like, "No problem, it's fine." I called them again the day before I arrive. Same thing. I'm like, "Can I pre-order some documents?" And they said, "Oh, well, we'll just pull up the draft catalog for you." I'm like, "Okay." So they pull up the draft catalog. I go to order. There's a run of 84 letters. Like 1 through 84, I need all of them. And so I asked, I'm like, "Is it possible that I can like call up a run?" So you have to fill out a slip for every single letter and can only call up 4 at a time. I was like, I have one day. This is not going to work for me. So I said, "Is it possible to call up a run?" And they said, "Well, they're not kind of bundled together that way. We don't know how they're bundled. Are they bundled according to size? Are they bundled according to number? We don't know. So we'll check on it." So I'm sitting in that small record office and I'm like twiddling my thumbs, waiting. And then the archivist comes by and she's like, "I'm so sorry." And I'm like, "What?" She's like, "I'm so sorry. Somebody should have told you this either of the 2 times you called. But these papers were a confidential deposit when they were put into the archive in 1949.
Which is why they didn't show up on the catalog.
And you can't see them."
Oh, wow.
I was like, "Nah." No.
Yeah.
So I've been hunting these
fun.
papers for 4 years. I finally found them. I'm in the archive with them, and they're telling me I've done everything. I did all my due diligence, did everything I was supposed to do,
them.
and they told me I couldn't see them. Now, generally in that kind of a case, you have to have the permission from the family member to see the papers. I'm like, the Viscount told me where they were. I'm pretty sure he will let me see them. Great. The archivist was nervous about the fact that these dealt with a scandal involving a member of the royal family.
Yeah.
And so she required me to contact the Royal Archives and get their permission before I could see these papers, despite the fact that they belonged to the Viscount Ullswater's family, and despite the fact that so I had to write him immediately on the spot. And this meant basically my trip to the archive was complete waste. I spent all that time on the train getting there, all of that. I just had to go home because I wasn't allowed to see anything.
Yeah.
And then I had to wait. So I had to contact the Viscount, and then I also had to write a 2-page letter arguing my case to the Royal Archives on my phone on the train because I had no other option, which is like the most awkward thing. You don't want to screw up when you write the Royal Archives.
Like really
no, it's not good. But I was really fortunate, but I kept waiting. I had to twiddle my thumbs. And I have a finite amount of time when I'm in England. So I was like, I really hope they get back to me before I have to fly out. Okay. And so the Viscount got back immediately, like the next day. He basically cleared it and said, I want Carolyn Day to have access to these papers, and please let the Royal Archives know it is my wish that they're not confidential any longer. So a week goes by. Finally, the Royal Archives contacts me. They yank 10 of the letters. I'm not allowed. They pull 10 of the 84.
So that you are allowed to see?
That I was not allowed to see.
Okay.
They still censored what I was allowed to see. So there's still this is at work, right? And it's still very difficult. And so it can be a lot of hoops that you jump through. So it's not simply like, oh, I see something in the library catalog. You have to do a lot of hunting.
Yeah.
If I'm looking for secondary literature, my first stop is not like, say, the Furman Library catalog. Yeah. My first stop is WorldCat, which is like, I don't know if you're familiar with WorldCat.
I may have used it once or twice.
Okay, so it'll give you a list of everything in all the most of the libraries in the world, and that gives you a real sense of what is the actual historiography, who's actually written books on whatever this subject is. Maybe I should go look at those. And then if I'm trying to judge if it's a brand new topic and I don't know, how because somebody could publish a book, it's not a very good book, you don't know. So then I can go look at scholarly reviews of the book to determine was this considered a highly regarded book or not. And that's a good way of kind of vetting your sources, of figuring out what are the actual really big books in the field that are being written about this topic, and then which are the ones that are the good ones, and which are the ones that are controversial ones, and which are the ones that people are constantly citing, either arguing for or against. And those are the books you want to have some sort of mastery over in a subject area. So that's always a good place to start. And sometimes WorldCat gives you primary sources, sometimes they don't. But with WorldCat, you can then say, find in a library, and it'll tell you if it's in our library or if it's in a library close to us, and then you can order it through Pascal or ILL, unless it's some, horrible primary document that, is only one copy in the world exists, and then you just have to go to that archive, so.
Yeah. I feel like I believe I'm talking about the right thing. My sophomore year, which is an interesting fact, we did the research paper at the end of that class for our European history and English classes, and I feel like our teacher showed us WorldCat and just the way you can use it to get the different records. And,
that's great.
I looked up Scandinavia, which was fun, but at the same time not a whole lot of primary sources there on what I was trying to write about, which it spiraled out of control quickly.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the things, choosing a topic is really important, especially for a research paper in college. I know that I'm going to have to travel to England to do my research. I know that. The reality is the reality. I don't do the kind of research that I can only use, digitized manuscripts or digitized newspapers, things like that. There are plenty of things that you can do and never have to go because we have this plethora of digital humanities now, which, don't get me wrong, makes it so much easier. But the kind of stuff I do requires heavy archival work. So for me, I know I have to go to England. But if you're writing a topic, you want to make sure you can pick something that you actually have access to both primary and secondary sources that you can lay your hands on, either in a digitized format, or you can ILL things in, or there are other kind of creative ways of getting access to things. Google Books for primary sources is actually really good. You'll have to go in and search it and date delimit it, and then you still have to dig through, because there's a lot, depending on what your topic is. There's a lot of American sources. It's very hit or miss as to what is covered, because it's dependent on what the libraries want to digitize, but there's still a lot of stuff out there.
Do you ever use JSTOR?
I do. JSTOR is the first stop for like scholarly articles and for scholarly reviews as well. So book reviews, it's always a good kind of stop for that as well.
Articles and book reviews, okay. Do you enjoy research? I would guess the answer is yes.
I love research. I love it. I love being in the archives and finding like the coolest thing. I have been known to accidentally giggle out loud in the archives, which is probably not the best thing, but it's totally fine. I found this amazing thing in the archives 2 years ago. It was a 100-page handwritten narrative. It's a revenge narrative.
Interesting.
Of a love story between the guy who wrote the book, the narrative, and his wife, who dies of tuberculosis.
Oh, okay.
She is in the 1760s. She is made her family's heiress. She has an older brother who's insane. You have to be pretty insane as a man to be disinherited in favor of a woman in the 1760s. So she becomes the family heiress. She falls in love with the local vicar. They try to run away and make an elopement, do a Gretna marriage the first time, and then they try to get away. She gets caught. She can't get out of the house the first time. The second time, she's caught by her family. Her family locks her in a room above the porch for 2 years. They put her under house arrest.
Fun.
After 2 years, she's legally of age, and they give her a choice. They're like, it's the money or the vicar, and she chooses the vicar, and they throw her out into the street with only the clothes on her back. She has to take her belongings, and her mother says, if you can't carry them, you can't take any of them. And so they kick her out. She goes, she's married by a special license the next day to the vicar. And she, by this point, is suffering from consumption, from tuberculosis, and she's increasingly getting unwell. So they go to Bath to try and, get her medical attention. And her family finds out, one of her aunts runs into the doctor, and the doctor's like, she's not going to make it. She's on her deathbed. And they refuse to see her.
Wow.
After she dies, the vicar, a husband, writes a 100-page handwritten revenge narrative. He calls it a tale of uncommon parental barbarity and cruelty.
Right.
Basically, he says their treatment of her is what ruined her constitution and made her sick and killed her. And he plans to publish this. He takes an ad out in the newspaper to publish it, and they are wealthy enough that they stop the publication. So he's like, fine. They can't stop me from circulating it in manuscript form. So he circulates this revenge narrative in manuscript form. I mean, this is stuff that reads like a novel. You can't make this up. And it's really fascinating. And I love stuff like that. I mean, it's things like that nobody's done anything with, that you come across in the archives. It's just amazing.
It's like one of those unique.
It's the best when you find something or you read something and you're just like flabbergasted by it. You're just like, what? Did I just read what I just read? Like, are you kidding me? It's unbelievable. I love researching. It's my favorite.
Do you enjoy writing?
Writing is a more difficult thing. I don't loathe writing. I mean, but I find it more difficult than the researching. I think the researching is a lot more fun than the writing. Partly because there's always that frustration for trying to sort of perfect, trying to get onto paper the ideas in your head are a very difficult thing. You get something onto paper, but it's never as good as you could talk it a lot better than you can write it sometimes. And so it is, and then if you do too much research, then you kind of get bogged down in, but I have these 900 really amazing examples. Which one do I choose, right? So I do find it can be a frustrating but a very rewarding process. So I don't hate writing, but I like researching more than I like writing. My supervisor was the exact opposite. He told me one day, he goes, "Oh, I hate researching." I'm like, "What is wrong with you? You're a historian. What is wrong with you?" And he's like, "Oh, I love writing." And I'm thinking, that's the worst part about what we do. What? No.
All right, so I already asked if you'd been published. How do you submit your scholarly work?
So the submission process is different for articles versus books, for instance. So articles, generally speaking, you write an article and then you choose a journal you're going to submit it to based off of best fit, the kind of topic, these sorts of things. You have to follow the journal submission guidelines. So every journal has different submission guidelines, different ways in which they want you to structure footnotes or endnotes, different word counts that you have to pay very specific attention to. Like the margins have to be very specific. If you mess with any of that, they can reject you out of hand. So like if your paper is over the word limit, they will just send it back. Sorry.
Do they also does that regard in regard to citations?
It can be. I know in the sciences in particular, if your citation forms are wrong, they will kick it back immediately. So it depends on the journal. It depends on the editor. So what happens is you submit your article, and if they don't like it, they just reject it out of hand. If they think it has potential, they then send it out for blind peer review. So peer review, basically, the person who gets your article does not know, your name's not on it, they have no idea that you're the person writing it, in theory. Now, in practice, it can work out a little bit differently. So, in theory, they then review the thing and they make kind of an assessment of the article. They determine its validity. Do they think that, because they usually send it to people who are sort of experts or at least know something about your field. And so they make that determination of, is this valid? What needs to be fixed? Should it be published? They then make a recommendation to the editorial board. The editorial board then can, in some cases, also have its own comment. And they will make a recommendation for reject, revise and resubmit, which is really common in history in particular, particularly higher end journals. A lot of times a revise and resubmit is basically fix two things, we just can't accept it immediately.
Yeah.
Or just accept with minor corrections is an option as well. But increasingly we're seeing, at least in history, that especially as you get to those bigger journals, it's an automatic revise and resubmit, even if it's really great. So we had this issue. The article that just went out was a co-authored article with an art historian, and we actually had we got a revise and resubmit, and we were like, what? I mean, all of the readers' reports were incredibly positive. So we were like, why is the editorial board ignoring the readers' reports? What's going on? And they were like, no, we're really excited about this article. If you could just make a nod to something. And we kind of left them hanging because we were mad about it. And we finally got her, and we were busy, to be fair. I was in England running around archives. She was also, running around archives in England and doing stuff. And so we finally, this summer, got around to doing the corrections. And it was very minor corrections. It was things like, I added a footnote here. I, changed this wording on this thing. We submitted it, and we submitted it at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon, and by noon on Friday, they're like, we would like to say congratulations, we accept it. So we were like, well, apparently it was about checking some boxes rather than legitimately, I don't even know if they read it. I have no idea. So, so it just depends on where you are. Now, book manuscript is different. A book manuscript, you send out a proposal usually. You circulate it to an editor at a press. And if they are interested, they will then maybe ask to see the full manuscript. And if they read the full manuscript and are interested, then they will let you know they're going to send it out for review. So again, it's a blind review. Comes back. So you usually have up to at least 3 readers, usually. So once it's sent out to readers, they will make kind of suggestions, corrections, all of these things. And once they've done that, the editorial board will make a decision based on those readers' report if they want to move forward and give you a contract. And then basically you have to kind of work through your revisions, work through the editorial process, You can have a contract, and they can choose to revoke that contract if they change their mind at some point.
Yeah.
And then you go through, like, okay, so you make the corrections, and then they accept those corrections. And then you have, like, page proofs. So then, like, once they've kind of said everything and you've done all the corrections, then you have to go through and you have to do that, and you have to make an index. So there's all of these other sort of layers before it finally goes
Very
to press.
in-depth process.
Yes, indeed. It can take, it's usually a 2-year process to get from a book from submission to publication.
And how do you often find yourself citing your sources? Do you use one style? Like
I do.
Chicago
I'm a
or
historian.
Harvard?
We use Chicago. I mean, that's what we do.
Oh, Chicago.
Chicago style.
Makes
Now, there are
sense.
different variations on Chicago style. We use footnotes because that is the way in which you can reproduce your evidence. We don't generally use in-text citations as historians because if you just did a last name and a date, what if you have, and I've had this in the past, what if you have, and I've had primary sources where this is a problem, where I've had 2 books by the same author published in the same year.
Wow.
How do I know which one it was in the same paper? And so I then literally had to go back and reread my source because we had done this short citation for a particular project. And I had to reread both sources to try and figure out where that information came from. And so it's really important that, and footnotes are also, it's not just for citing, but it's also for explaining things further. Things that would break the flow of the narrative, things that you feel like need further explanation, or if you want to point somebody to somebody else's work.
Yep.
We do that as well.
So I actually had more questions, but over the course of the conversation,
Sort of answered
all
most of them. Excellent. Good.
So that is actually everything.
Fabulous.
Thank you very much.
You're
I appreciate it.
welcome. Not a problem.